Over 60 years ago, Southeast Asia would be forever changed. This change brought about murder, altered landscape, and the divide of a great country, still felt today. People developed rashes, defects, and were drove outside of their own homes, fearing death. In this video, we will be discussing the anti-Vietnam War movements formed by the American and Australian public on the home front. This signified the beginning of the gruesome Vietnam War.
Citizens on the home front were initially inspired by courage, bravery, triumph, and then victory. This structure, although immediately seemed lasting and supported by many until the war was over, this was a facade of what was to come.
The Viet Cong simultaneously attacked just about every major city and town in South Vietnam. In one day, they increased the scope of the war dramatically.
After 13 years of intense and brutal fighting, the South Vietnamese seemed to be on the winning side of the war. The Tet Offensive of 1968 caught the forces of the South Vietnamese along with its allies off guard. The offensive was a series of attacks led by the rebel Viet Cong, supported by the North Vietnamese Communist regime, on small villages, cities, and towns throughout South Vietnam. Despite the heavy casualties suffered by the attackers, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had achieved a strategic victory, all while protests were being held on the home front. Though the initial victories at Khe Sanh and Long Tan had heightened the public support for the Australian and American troops, the significant defeats after the Tet Offensive brought about a realization across the two great nations that they were not invincible.
Now, with pressure from the people, the course of the Vietnam War was greatly skewed. From a guaranteed victory from the South to the North taking over, spreading their communistic independence with them. The Americans had lost their morale and support back home, evident with less and less amount of people entering the war, with most of the people refusing their conscription.
The soldiers were only doing their duty in preventing the spread of communism at all costs. They were following their orders, but this was not taken into consideration when the soldiers were shown killing innocent people and when they later came home after the war had ended.
Bà con chúng tôi sinh sống ở một cái làng quê rất là yên bình. Bỗng dưng vào 5 giờ 30 của buổi sáng ngày 16 tháng 3 số 8 là quân đội Mỹ bắn xối xả vào làng tôi, dí súng vào trong người, họ bắt 6 mẹ con tôi chui lại vào cái hầm tránh phố của gia đình. Thân xác của mẹ, chị và các em tôi đã tan tành. Đứa em gái út của tôi đứt làm đôi. Thì lúc này là tôi bị thương và tôi nằm thiếp ở trong cái ngôi hầm này. Mãi đến 4 giờ chiều Mỹ rút đi. Cha tôi và các người trong làng còn sót lại về để lượm xác chết lên để chôn, thấy tôi còn thở.
This would only signify the start of a massive decline in troop morale and support for the war effort. Although there was already an anti-Vietnam War movement in place, with prominent figures such as the Save Our Sons movement, major protests in America and Australia were only beginning. Conscription was being refused while the war efforts decreased. The Spring Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam was a coalition of anti-war activists in America. The group was formed in 1967 to organize large demonstrations to oppose war effort and support for the Vietnam War. The first demonstration began on April 15, 1967. The group began a massive march from Central Park to the United Nations headquarters. The march attracted thousands of people, including Dr. Martin Luther King, who spoke at the event. In Australia, 63,000 men were conscripted into the army, and 19,000 were deployed in Vietnam. Following the losses suffered by the capitalist attackers, the idea of being on the losing side of the war began to rise amongst the American and Australian people on the home front. The Save Our Sons movement was one of many that attempted to raise awareness on the pressing issue of underage conscription. The campaign was aimed at men under 18 who were conscripted into the army. So Dennis, how do you feel about Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War?
So I think Australia did do their part in Vietnam. They made a name for themselves, which is what they have been trying to do in World War One and World War Two. So the Battle of Long Tan, which was pretty crucial in Vietnam, as it kind of showed like a change of turn in the war. And as you all know, that in the Battle of Long Tan, the Australians did manage to fight off a lot of Viet Minh, and this just shows that they're a force to be reckoned with, and they can fight alongside other great nations like America and European countries.
In 1975, the Vietnam War had ended, with the Tet Offensive seen as the main turning point of war. The veterans returned home and were abused and cursed, the result of brutal, bloody and disappointing war.
Good evening. I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam.